didn't hear me when I said that.
All right, we're back on the record on State versus Loyd. He's present with his attorney, state attorney's office.
Sure.
Good, everybody? All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you all had a good lunch. We're missing someone?
Up the elevator.
Okay. He's on his way up. The elevators are slow. Everybody have a good lunch? Did you get caught in the rain? You know, if you hold those masks over your head, the water runs right off them. Welcome back, everyone. It is the defense's turn to ask questions. Ms. Miller, you may inquire. And you may remove your mask.
Thank you on both accounts. Good afternoon. It is now weird to be standing in front of you not wearing a mask. And I just want to say first, we appreciate that you all are sacrificing. Everybody in this courtroom appreciates the sacrifice that you all are making in being here. And so I don't want you to think that goes unnoticed. And I also want you to know that I appreciate, from your perspective, this seems tedious. And so what I would ask is you would show the same grace or appreciation that a man's life is on the line. And so all of us take this process very seriously, okay? And so I'm not trying to belabor the point. It's just a huge responsibility we're asking as jurors if you're selected. Everybody with me? Okay. Mr. Williams talked a lot about experiences that you all may have had with law enforcement that shaped your opinions on law enforcement, right? And some people have strong feelings one way or another about law enforcement officers that aren't shaped on specific experiences. We all come into this courtroom from different backgrounds, different walks of life, being raised differently, and that's totally okay. And so I want to, for the purpose of this conversation, sort of put out the law stuff and just have a conversation about our feelings, okay? And I know it's weird to ask that in a court of law. Juror in seat number 27. If I could start with you, sir. Excellent paddle holding. Would you, microphone. Would you agree or disagree with this statement? Law enforcement officers are deserving of more credibility, or they are more believable?
No, I would not agree with that.
Why not?
I think everybody's actions are judged by their own.
Okay. If I could ask you to pass the microphone to juror number 26, or in seat number 26. Juror in seat number 26, would you agree that law enforcement is deserving of more credibility, or law enforcement officers are more believable?
No, I wouldn't agree that they're more credible. Everybody's human. You see what you think you see.
Okay. And I see somebody nodding his head behind you. Juror in seat number 42, if I could ask you to pass that microphone. Other shoulder. I saw you nodding. Is law enforcement deserving of more credibility, or are law enforcement officers more believable?
Well, I think they are.
And what makes you say that?
They're held to a higher standard than we are.
Sir, I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
You hear me now?
Yes. He
They're
said,
held
correct me.
to a higher standard than we are.
Okay. And so the question, again, no right or wrong answers. And a cheesy analogy we sometimes use is that if this were an arson trial and your house burned down yesterday, you would probably not be the exact right fit for this case. Does that make sense?
Probably.
Right? And so, again, no right or wrong answers. The question is, the law requires each juror to treat all witnesses the same when they walk in this courtroom. As Mr. Williams said, you as a juror, if you're seated, can believe or disbelieve any or all of a witness's testimony.
Okay.
And some people say to me, no problem. And some people say, I'm going to give an officer just a little bit more credibility, or that person's going to start out a little bit ahead just because he comes in this courtroom, he or she, identified as a law enforcement officer. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
Okay. And so it sounds like that's what you're, I know, the mics are terrible, the masks are terrible. I appreciate you sticking with me. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like that's what you're telling me, that law enforcement... No, that's not what you're telling me? What are you telling me?
I just tell you they're held to a higher standard than we are. I don't know how to put that.
She can't hear you. Say that again for me.
They're held to a higher standard than we are. That's the only reason I said that.
Okay. But that would be about law enforcement categorically.
Yes.
Okay. And so if somebody comes into this courtroom, you are of the belief that that officer is held to a higher standard than somebody who's not an officer, right?
I would believe so, yes.
And it sounds like to me that would affect your opinion of somebody on the witness stand.
No, it wouldn't.
Why not?
Even as officers, they're all gauged on their actions, like you said.
Okay. Would you say if we were at a race and somebody's a law
Excuse me?
enforcement, if we're at a race, we're running a race.
Oh, race.
okay? And somebody's a law enforcement officer, somebody's not a law enforcement officer. Does the law enforcement officer in the credibility race start out a little bit ahead for you?
I don't think so.
Okay. On this side of the room, which we identify as the right, I know you all are looking at us from the left. Does anyone feel similarly to juror in seat number 42, that law enforcement starts, or excuse me, that law enforcement's held to a higher standard, was his words? Show of hands or paddles. Juror number 10. Tell me what you think, please. Oh, sorry, microphone.
I believe they are held to a higher standard, or we want to believe that.
Sure.
And so I believe coming into the courtroom, they would start higher. They might not end that way.
Okay. So, and I don't know if that made sense, what I was discussing with juror in seat number 42. You as a juror, if you're selected, can believe or disbelieve any or all of a witness's testimony, right? You could hear from a police officer and say, I don't believe a word that man said, or woman, right? And obviously the state's provided a witness list, Mr. Lenneman's provided a witness list. Both of those lists include law enforcement officers, which is why we're talking about it. And again, no right or wrong answers. For you, do you think law enforcement officers coming in identified as a law enforcement officer starts out a little bit ahead?
I do.
Okay. And so it sounds like to me, for you, you would have a little bit of trouble following that instruction of let's treat everybody the same until we hear from them.
And I think the hearing from them is what makes the difference.
Okay. And so again, I don't know, we just met, right? Or we met several days ago when you had the good fortune of being in these chairs. And so I don't know what's going on in your mind. And some people say, I have no problem with that. And some people say, no, I know for me, I'm going to be thinking that this person, because he or she is wearing the uniform with the badge, the gun, that I just know that I'm going to start out believing that person a little bit more than if that person wasn't a police officer. And that's okay.
I believe I would.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Anybody else on this side of the room? Juror 50 in seat 58.
I agree.
Sorry, can't hear a word you're saying.
The mics are going in and out a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Do you feel like you're on a cell phone commercial?
I don't necessarily think just because somebody's a police officer, they're telling the truth, but I would give them a little bit more credibility to start with.
Okay.
Just I think naturally than somebody that's not a police officer.
Okay. Where do you think that belief comes from for you?
I believe that the vast majority of police officers are good people and are going to do the right thing. I think at a higher percentage of a non-police officer.
But would you say that that's a belief that you have because that's how you were raised? You see what I'm saying? Or is there something that you can identify as like, this is where my belief about law enforcement comes from?
I think maybe just the way I was raised, being a veteran, my experience with police officers throughout my life. Again, I don't necessarily think that every police officer always tells the truth, but I would certainly hold them a little bit higher to start with.
Okay. And so then the follow-up question is, right, the judge is going to instruct, just because somebody walks in here, a police officer, you could hear from him, you could hear from an officer about his or her training, experience, etc., and you can decide if I want to believe or disbelieve this person. The question is, because somebody comes in here as a law enforcement officer, before you hear anything they say that either lends itself to, yes, I believe this person, or no, I don't, does that person, just because he or she is a law enforcement officer, start out a little bit ahead for you?
Yes, I think they start out.
Okay.
I couldn't disbelieve what they're saying, but I do think they start out a little bit ahead for me.
Okay. And now I'm going to ask you to pass back to juror 42, because you're a head nodder, and so now I want to know what you think. I can see you nodding, so tell me now, it sounds like, or it appeared to me, based on your affirmative head nodding, that you agreed with the juror behind you.
Yes.
Okay. And so, all right, I don't need to belabor that. Thank you, sir. Anybody else on my right, your left side of the courtroom? Juror in seat 23. You had to know I was going to ask you. Tell me what your thoughts are. Do police officers, because they come into this courtroom identified as law enforcement, start out a little bit ahead than somebody who's not a police officer?
No, they do not.
Why do you say that?
I do agree that they're held to a higher standard, but that's the way they conduct business and how they present themselves outside. we're supposed to be treating everybody equal that walks through here and judging their testimony based on what they're giving, not their status. So, yeah, no.
Okay, and that's where, again, there's going to be what's called direct examination and cross-examination of during the state's case in chief, and then flipped during the defense case in chief. And if you hear from an officer about his or her training and experience and you think, man, I really believe this officer, that's totally okay. The question is, for some people, because somebody comes in here identified as a law enforcement officer, because of our background, walks of life, some people just believe police officers more. Does that make sense?
It does.
Is that you?
No, ma'am.
Okay. I'm now going to go to the left side, your right side. Anybody show of paddles agree that law enforcement starts out more believable or more credible than somebody who's not law enforcement? Juror 37, tell me what you think, please.
I think they are more believable, in my opinion.
Okay.
Just because what they do every day and the sacrifices they make, it takes, a certain type of person to be able to do that. So personally, yes, I think they are more believable. And I deal with them, I work with them daily, so I've seen them have my back. I've seen, on a daily basis, them conduct themselves and how they act. So my personal experiences make me feel that way.
Okay, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. And there's no right or wrong answers. I'm not trying to talk anybody out of their beliefs, right? Just figure out what they are.
Yes, ma'am.
And so again, the question becomes then, once a witness takes the stand, you can believe or disbelieve if you're seated as a juror, any or all of that witness's testimony. It sounds like what you're telling me is before you hear anything, you're inclined to believe somebody who is identified as a law enforcement officer.
I wouldn't necessarily say I believe them, but I would be more inclined to, I don't know how to explain. I would believe them. I would have no reason not to believe them. I would believe that they're going to tell me the truth, absolutely.
Okay. And so the analogy that I used over here, if there are two people at a race, it's a silly example, but if there's two people at a race and one is a law enforcement officer and one is not, does the law enforcement officer start out ahead for you?
For me, yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Anybody else? Show of hands. I'm going to have to call on some folks. Juror number 5, if you don't mind. Is a law enforcement officer deserving of more credibility or more
No.
believability? Why not?
Because I know police officers, a lot of them, they lie. Some people lie. It's all about the evidence. It's all about what's presented. I don't necessarily hold anybody above any standards more than anybody else till I hear what it is the testimony is.
And so the follow-up question is, because somebody comes in, before you hear a word that that person has to say, just identified as a cop, it doesn't feel like you're
No.
saying, okay.
Absolutely not.
Anybody having a reaction or feelings they'd like to share? Juror number 33 in seat 33. If I could talk to you for just a moment.
Yes.
Does a police officer start out for you more deserving of credibility or believability than somebody who is not a police officer?
I think police officers, law enforcement, certain trade fields have respect.
Trade guilds, is that what you said, sir?
Trade, different
Got it.
jobs
Okay.
have as they walk in, would have more respect. Now, does that go to, I'm not Italian, but my hands get going.
Yeah, no, I do it too. That's they give me one of these, but she can't hear you if you don't use the microphone.
But do you, if our task is to look at everything fairly, one officer versus someone off the street, in my opinion, start at the same place. You may respect one more, but it doesn't mean you have to believe them until you see the facts.
Okay.
Ms. Miller, let me interject here for a moment. Folks, I'm going to read you the jury instruction on law enforcement testimony. The fact that a witness is employed in law enforcement does not mean that his or her testimony deserves more or less consideration than that of any other witness. That is the jury instruction that is read to jurors at the end. Ms. Miller, you may proceed.
Thank you, Judge. That makes sense, what the judge just said, Juror 33? Sure. Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to stick with you for a moment, if you don't mind, and switch topical areas. I want to talk to you about whether or not Mr. Loyd chooses to become a witness in this case. Okay?
One more time.
I would like to change topics and talk about something a little bit different, which is whether or not Mr. Loyd chooses to become a witness in this case. Okay? Would you agree with this statement? If the defendant doesn't testify, he's probably guilty.
No.
Why not?
It's up to the lawyer defending that person and that person
Okay.
to see if it is best for the case at hand.
Okay. And so you wouldn't hold that against Mr. Loyd if he does not become a witness in this case?
No.
All right. But what I mean by that is, again, there's no right or wrong answers. Everybody comes from different backgrounds, walks of life, personal experiences. Some people say to me, you know, if I don't hear from him, I know they got to prove it, but if he doesn't tell me his side of the story, I'm going to assume he's guilty. Or that's going to be in the back of my mind when I'm deliberating. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Do you feel similarly?
That if he doesn't, if the person on trial doesn't say something?
Yes, sir.
No.
Okay. That wouldn't affect your decision-making as to whether or not the state has proven Mr. Loyd guilty beyond a reasonable doubt?
Again, you got to look at all the evidence.
Okay.
And just because the defendant doesn't speak doesn't mean he's guilty or not guilty.
Okay. Thank you, sir. And juror in seat number 47, I sort of saw you nodding or having some sort of reaction. What are your thoughts about whether or not the defendant testifies?
If the defendant does not testify, that is not evidence. So it's not evidence. So it's nothing I would consider.
Okay. But I guess, could you follow my point that some people think if I don't hear from this person, that's going to be weighing in my mind?
No.
No. All right. So different question is, you understand that Mr. Loyd has pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so he's not disputing committing the act. He's saying, I am not responsible because I was insane. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So for you to make the decision about whether we have proven him not guilty by reason of insanity, would you need to hear from Mr. Loyd to reach that verdict?
No.
Same sort of logic? Whether we meet our burden or not has nothing to do with whether or not he testifies?
Right. It'll be the evidence and the testimony because by myself, I'm not qualified to assess sanity.
Well, you are going to be asked if we have proven that by clear and convincing evidence. So the state has to prove all of the elements of the crime and that Mr. Loyd is the one who committed those elements. But then when it comes to not guilty by reason of insanity, the defense has the burden. It's one of the few times the defense ever has a burden, and we have to prove by a lesser standard that he's not guilty by reason of insanity. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Any problem with whether or not he testifies in reaching either of those decisions?
No.
Okay. I'm going to talk now to what I'm going to identify as the left side of the room. You all are on the right. Anyone think, you know, if I don't hear from him, it's because he's guilty? Show of hands or paddles? No right or wrong answers? You know, if you don't volunteer, this is where Mr. Williams and I do agree, we call on folks. Juror number 51.
Yes, ma'am.
Tell me what your thoughts are. Would you agree with this statement? If a defendant doesn't testify, chooses not to testify, it's because he's guilty?
No, I do not concur.
Why not?
It may be in his best interest. Maybe he wouldn't be persuasive. Maybe his lawyer says the case is going well as is. You don't need to get up there in front. We've done what we need to do. So by no means.
Okay. Would you agree with this statement? The state of Florida has to prove him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of the crimes they've alleged.
That is my understanding what their aim is.
Yep. Or he's not guilty, right, if they fail to prove it.
Correct.
Okay. If they don't prove him guilty, whether or not you hear anything from this side of the courtroom, does that change whether or not they've met their burden? Does that make sense?
I'm still drafting the your question, but I would probably, she's been, what the law is in different situations.
All right, hold on then. I'm going to read you the jury instruction on this.
I was gonna say, she will continue to do that.
In every criminal proceeding, a defendant has the absolute right to remain silent. At no time is it the duty of a defendant to prove his innocence. From the exercise of a defendant's right to remain silent, a jury is not permitted to draw any inference of guilt, and the fact that a defendant did not take the witness stand must not influence your verdict in any manner whatsoever. You may proceed, Ms. Miller.
Thank you. And so back to you, Juror 51, in seat 51. Your juror number is in fact 505. It's a little bit confusing. Again, some people say to me, no problem with that. Some people say, I just know for me that I'm going to be thinking about whether or not he took the witness stand when I'm deciding if the state has met its burden in proving him guilty. Okay. And again, I want us to imagine that we're having these conversations like 3 weeks ago, before you knew anything about Markeith Loyd or jury summons, if we were just having coffee and we were having these conversations, right? Because again, I don't think anybody is setting out to try to not follow the judge's instructions by any stretch of the imagination. With me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. If I could ask you, let's go next door, 52. What do you think? Would you agree if a defendant doesn't testify, it's because he's guilty?
No, I don't agree.
Why not?
There's different reasons that somebody may or may not want to testify. So, and it may be, he may be listening to his lawyers if they advised him not to testify.
Okay. And so I don't think I articulated this well to your neighbor. The state goes first, right? And so they have to prove him guilty. If they fail to do that, whether or not we do a thing over there, he's still not guilty, right?
Yes.
Does anybody on this side of the room disagree with that? Or not understand what I'm asking is probably a better question. I'm going to come way down to the front. Juror number 1.
Yes.
Would you agree if a defendant doesn't testify, it's because he's guilty?
No.
Why not?
So it's not his burden to do.
Okay. And so the state's going to present evidence, whether or not they prove him guilty. If they don't, what we do, he's still not guilty. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Do you agree or disagree?
I agree.
Let's flip that now. You understand that Mr. Loyd has pled not guilty by reason of insanity. And that is something we as the defense attorneys have to prove by clear and convincing evidence. So beyond a reasonable doubt is the highest burden you as seated jurors would ever be asked to apply to facts. Clear and convincing evidence is more like here. It's a lesser burden. And not guilty by reason of insanity is still not guilty. And so a little bit of a different question. Do you think you would have a hard time saying I could find somebody not guilty by reason of insanity to this lesser standard?
No.
Okay. Any thoughts on that? All right. Thank you, sir. Let's juror number in seat number 2.
Yes, ma'am.
What do you think? If a defendant doesn't testify, is it because he's guilty?
No, ma'am. Just like the gentleman next to me, it's not his burden, and both sides have their own strategy.
And so whether or not they meet their burden has really nothing to do with what we do over here.
Correct.
We could, in theory, play cards. I suspect we're not going to do that,
True.
right? But they have to prove this. Maybe their case sucks. We don't have to do anything.
Exactly.
All right. Agree with that?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. All right. Coming to this side of the courtroom. Is there anybody who has strong feelings about whether or not the defendant testifies and whether that would affect your ability to reach a verdict in this case? I'm going to call on folks, but if anybody had any obvious thoughts they wanted to share, juror in seat 15, if you don't mind.
Do not. It's his Fifth Amendment right.
Okay. And again, I think most people, I think, understand where I'm going with this, right? I have a fear that somebody would say, for me, in the back of my head, I would have a nagging feeling that if I didn't hear from him, it's because he's guilty. What are your thoughts?
I don't feel that way.
Okay. Switching to not guilty by reason of insanity, right? That is a different question than has the state met its burden, right? So now the defense has assumed a burden of proving something. and that is that Mr. Loyd was insane at the time of this incident.
Okay.
Do you think to reach that kind of decision, whether we've met our burden, Mr. Loyd would need to testify?
No.
Same logic?
Yes.
That it strategical or whatever?
Correct.
All right, thank you, sir.
Welcome.
Juror in seat 41. I saw you nodding. Sorry. That's what we do watch for head nods and eye contact and avoidance of eye
You're
contact.
good.
What do you think? If the defendant doesn't testify, is it because he's guilty?
No.
Why not?
He has the right to remain silent.
Sure. Can you appreciate sort of what I'm getting at is that some people think if I were in those circumstances or, you know, I heard what the judge told me, but I know for me, it's going to really bother me.
Yeah, twisted there. No, he doesn't have to speak. I feel he doesn't have to prove his innocence, and I wouldn't put any weight on that, no.
Okay. So that's what there's going to be two, in the first part of this trial, there's going to be two questions asked of jurors, really. Has the state proven each and every element of every crime alleged, and that Mr. Loyd is the person who committed those crimes, right? That's like one, is the state proven beyond a reasonable doubt he's the person who committed these crimes?
Yes.
Question two is, have we met the burden of proving that he's not guilty by reason of insanity?
Yes.
So not disputing that he did the acts, saying not legally responsible because I was insane.
Yes.
Do you think to make that second decision, you would need to hear from Mr. Loyd?
No, absolutely not.
Same sort of logic. You could hear from other witnesses, decide if we've met our burden, and whether or not Mr. Loyd chooses to become a witness has nothing to do with it.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with it.
All right, thank you, sir. Anybody feel differently or want to share thoughts? I promise it's more fun when it's interactive. No? I don't have a lot more. So a topical area I want to address, as Mr. Williams discussed, you know, there are things that are less than pleasant involved in this case. And we're not suggesting anybody wants to look at autopsy photos, but it may be part of the state's case in chief or the defense case in chief, right? Another thing you may hear is profanity or racial slurs. And so I want to know if anyone is so offended by use of the word cracker that you think it would affect your ability to fairly try this case. Anybody show of hands, right side or left side? I'm seeing no hands. Juror at 46 in seat 46, if I could come back to you. What are your thoughts about if you hear profanity or the use of racial slurs in this case? Will that affect you in your ability to render a verdict?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Any thoughts about that at all?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Let me ask you a different question since you've been kind of tucked away in the back corner.
Sure.
Law enforcement officers, do you believe they're deserving of more credibility or more believable than somebody who's not a law enforcement officer?
No, ma'am.
Why not?
All human.
Okay. Capable of making the same mistakes as anybody else?
Correct.
All right. Thank you, ma'am. Anybody on this side going back to racial slurs, profanity that thinks, you know, if I hear somebody called a cracker, I am going to be so deeply offended that I'm really not going to be able to listen to everything else. Does that make sense? On the left side, your right side, does that resonate with anybody? Anybody have anything they want to share? Okay. Seeing no hands or paddles? On my right side, your left side, anybody offended by the use of the word cracker to the extent that it would affect your ability to try this case? I'm seeing some head nods no. Anybody think yes or have thoughts they want to share? I'm seeing no hands or paddles. May I have just a moment, Your Honor?
Yes, ma'am. All right, thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I know you'll just be disappointed to hear that we don't have any other questions for you all. Actually, before I make that promise, let me see the attorneys at the bench for a minute, please. Okay. Here's what we're going to do. We need to speak with juror number 6 for just a few minutes. The rest of you, we don't have any other questions for you. You don't need to come back outside this courtroom until about 3 o'clock is what we're going to do. When you come back is we're going to tell you who's on the jury. And you don't have to wear those masks anymore. You can switch back to your regular mask. Please do not steal my paddles. Leave those in your chairs. Everybody but juror number 6, you can exit. You can go downstairs to the snack machines. If you're a smoker, you can go outside, but you need to be back outside in this hallway by 3 o'clock, please.
Stand next to you here so they can get out. Yep.
All right, sir, we just need to ask you the first part of the questions that you missed. So your juror number 6 and your juror number badge is 30, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. I only have a couple up for you, and then the state and the defense will have some. My first question is, has anybody talked to you? Have you seen anything or read anything since the last time you were in court about this case?
No, ma'am. Nobody's spoken to me. I have spoken to my job and to my family about what's going on, but nobody has spoken to me.
When you mean about what's going on, you're talking about the fact that you may have to serve as a juror?
That is correct.
Or the facts of the case?
That I may be selected for a jury.
All right. Have any of your circumstances changed since we first spoke?
I was involved in a car accident last night with all the rain.
Okay.
And a state trooper was not able to come out because of the activity. So I have this vehicle accident thing that I'm trying to get straightened out. I wasn't aware that I needed to be here today. So I haven't been able to kind of level set with my company to get things straightened out if I was not going to be in office. Our COO is going to be out for this week on vacation, which makes me the next senior person at the organization. Maybe a bit of a hardship. We lost our IT guy 2 weeks ago. I'm the next closest thing to an IT person that would be there to support the business. I have a follow-up COVID shot on Thursday that I think I mentioned the last time that I was here.
Is that your second shot?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And I do not have any bags packed. Wasn't aware I needed to be here today.
Did you not call on Friday?
Friday is the only day that I did not call, and I called every day, sometimes twice. I dialed extension 6. I got no feedback about my group except for Friday. There was also a note that said if you call and there's no info, we may call you. So I just kind of assumed somebody was going to call me.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. State, you may inquire.
Thank you, Your Honor. You don't happen to recall what question I was asking when you came in this morning, do you? And if you don't, it's okay.
I cannot recall.
That's okay. So, just like it has been for everything that we've done throughout this process, no right or wrong answer so long as it's your truthful opinion, okay? The first question I have for you is, as you can imagine, in a homicide trial, there will be some photographs of a somewhat graphic nature. Generally speaking, when there's a first-degree murder, an autopsy is performed. The medical examiner is called to testify, and photographs from the autopsy are shown with as limited number as possible. Is there anything about you that you think you could not physically look at the photographs without becoming ill or anything like that?
I do not think I would become ill by looking at pictures.
Do you think, or would you become so emotional that you could not focus on the evidence if you were required? Because no one wants to look at them, but if you were required to look at the photographs for purposes of evidence.
I do not believe so, no.
All right, thank you, sir. Have you or anyone close to you ever been the victim of a person's crime? And by that I mean a crime where a person either put their hands on you or a loved one, or verbally threatened them from a close distance. In other words, I'm not asking about a car burglar or anything like that, but a person's crime. You or anyone close to you.
Been involved in what sort of incident?
A what? I'm sorry?
Been involved in what sort of incident?
An incident where you or someone close to you was the victim of a person's crime. Somebody put their hands on you or a loved one in a violent way.
No, not that I can recall.
Okay. Have you or anyone close to you ever been arrested that you can recall?
Not. I believe my father may have been arrested when I was a child at one point for a traffic incident. That's all that I can recall, though.
Okay. Since you're having a hard time remembering it, I'm guessing it wasn't a memorable experience.
I was a very young person at that time. I may have been 5 or 6 years old.
Do you have enough of a memory to know or say whether or not he was treated fairly by law enforcement?
No, I can't answer that question.
Okay. Anything about your memory of that experience that you think would prevent you from being a fair and impartial juror in this case?
I do not believe so, no.
Now, this sort of dovetails into that, so I'll ask it now. You were asked questions about the ability to weigh a law enforcement officer's testimony equally at the start with a non-law enforcement officer's testimony. Do you have any issues with that general concept?
I do not.
You think you could do that?
I believe so, yes.
All right. Have you or anyone close to you ever had a bad experience with law enforcement? So my understanding is it certainly wasn't an arrest, but a traffic stop where the officer was extremely rude to you. You saw something a police officer did that really affected you. Anything like that that we should be aware of?
No, sir.
Were you present, sir? Do you remember being present for the questions about law enforcement?
I do not believe I was present for that question.
Okay. So there's, as there has been with everything, there's an instruction on the law that the judge will give you regarding when a law enforcement officer can use force to effect an arrest or perform his or her duties. Make sense?
Yes.
Generally speaking, do you believe, well, and let me back up again. Sometimes that force will be deadly force. Certainly you're aware of the fact that law enforcement at times uses deadly force, right?
I'm aware of that, yes.
Right. Do you believe that it is never appropriate for a law enforcement officer to use deadly force to effect an arrest?
I do. Appropriate?
Okay, so you think there are times when they can use deadly force?
Yes.
Right. Do you think that law enforcement uses deadly force too often in our society today?
I do not believe that.
So is it your view, and I'm interpreting, if I'm wrong, tell me then, that law enforcement uses force or deadly force in the appropriate circumstances as a whole here today in our society?
To the best of their abilities, yes. There's always exceptions.
Right. Understand that, and yes. Okay. Were you present for the conversation about Mr. Buxton's shoes?
I was.
Okay. And I think that's all the questions that I have, Judge. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Wilson.
You're welcome.
Do you have any questions? All right. Thank you, sir. You're free to join the other jurors. Come back by 3. Okay?
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. State, how long do you need?
One moment, Judge. Please, thank you. 30 minutes, Judge, if that's okay.
That's fine. Defense? All right, 30 minutes. I'll be back.
Thank you, Your Honor.